Thank you for coming tonight. It's a busy night on our campus. There are a lot of events, and so we're very grateful that you came tonight to support the event tonight. I am Susie Babka. I am in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies here at the University of San Diego. I am very pleased to be able to introduce two friends, but also two people that I admire both in their work and in their compassion. And so this is just a real honor, and as well as a joy, people who give me hope in these times. I also wanted to draw your attention to the events coming up. So we have two events in the immediate. We have more events, obviously, but two events coming up soon. One is Thursday, March 6th. So this is next Thursday, week from tonight, from 6 to 8 in Solomon Hall in Maher Hall. We show up because we are Jews, not despite being Jewish. Jews in solidarity with Palestinians. This is a lecture by Dr. Atalia Omer. Dr. Omer is a religion, conflict, and peace studies professor at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies and the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. Her research focuses on religion, violence, and peace building, as well as theories and methods in the study of religion. And then the second event to draw your attention to is a screening of the film The Palestinian Exception, which is on Wednesday, March 5th. And this is at San Diego State University in Hardy Tower 140 from 6:30 to 8:30. And I will remind you of these events at the end of our evening, and obviously for more information on these events, you can certainly contact us here at USD. So tonight's presentations, we were supposed to also be joined by Eric Vargas, who unfortunately can't be with us tonight due to illness. So our best wishes for a speedy recovery to Eric. Our first speaker is Dr. Ibrahim al-Marashi, who will present on hydrological histories and hydropolitics of the Levant. He is Associate Professor of Middle East History at California State University, San Marcos. His most recent book is A Concise History of the Middle East. He gave a brilliant lecture on this book. It was last week, right? Am I crazy? 2 weeks ago. Oh, I can't keep up. The time is just, I don't know what time it is. As soon as he gave the lecture, I was so impressed that I ran out and bought the book. And so I'm very grateful for his lecture. What we are going to do tonight, because he's short on time, he will be joining us from Zoom. And because he's short on time, we will be doing questions for him right after his presentation. And then following him will be our own USD's Professor John Halaka. He is a visual artist, professor of visual arts here at the University of San Diego. He has conducted extensive research in Palestine, including oral history work with Palestinian farmers. And without further ado, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. We always begin our events this way. It's one way of acknowledging the importance of remembering for decolonial purposes, indigeneity and how colonialism has so disrupted everything about society. We acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the traditional and unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. We pay respect to the citizens of the Kumeyaay Nation, both past and present, and their continuing relationship to their ancestral lands. Recognizing the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those on whose territory we reside, and a way of honoring the indigenous people who have been living and working the land from the beginning of history. It is important to understand the history that has brought us to reside on the land and to seek to understand our place within that history. Colonialism is a continuing process, and we must increase mindfulness of how we all participate in it. And if I remember the correct process of how to do this, we will now have Dr. Marashi stop share, and I think that will do it. Okay. Does that work? That work?
Thank you, Susie, for that very kind introduction. So I will be presenting on hydrological history and hydropolitics of the Levant, otherwise known as the Holy Land. This is a lecture that is really a kind of examination of ecological theology, or the relationship of ecology and theology in the long term. So Susie, thank you for giving us the land acknowledgement, but I just wanted to point out, even when I show you a map of the Kumai land, the Tijuana River and its basin are just a very good example of what we're looking at, the relationship between water and well, basically, the hydropolitics of the river basin that divides the Kumeyaay Nation, or now that straddles the U.S.-Mexico border. Um, I always want to also start out with a historical acknowledgement that in the following lecture, what I'm going to give is a historical overview to kind of bring us up to the present, and then where Professor Halaka will continue. Studying history will sometimes make you uncomfortable. Studying history will sometimes make you feel deeply upset. Studying history will sometimes make you feel extremely angry. If studying history always makes you feel proud and happy, you probably aren't studying history. So, if I begin with that, I want to look at the following problems in the Middle East. And number one is droughts, followed by earthquakes, countries overly dependent on grain, countries with bad leadership, bloated bureaucracies, displaced peoples, refugees fleeing to Europe, military conflicts, invasions. Now, of course, you look at these problems and automatically assume I would be talking about the current problems in the Middle East. But in fact, all of those problems, 1 through 6, while they do affect the Middle East, I'm actually speaking of the collapse of the Bronze Age. And so here we begin our historical overview of the relationship between water and conflict in the Middle East. And as we mentioned, I had given a lecture about 2 weeks ago where I tried to give Gaza its history, a history that was kind of denied to it before the events of October 7th, 2023. And when I'm saying I'm trying to give Gaza a history, if you notice these events, you'll notice that Gaza was there. Gaza witnessed it was literally on the border, the buffer zone between Egypt and the Canaanites. And if you notice, the conflicts are involving places that might sound familiar to you today: Ashkelon, Ashdod. And if you don't know what is Megiddo on this map, if I refer to Megiddo as Har Megiddo, of course, that's the place that gives us the term Armageddon. Okay. So, in other words, the inability to access water led to this catastrophic series of events, the collapse of the late Bronze Age, that of course serves as an important background to the Old Testament. I begin with that, but to go back a little earlier, I want to go to this place known as Ur, because for all intents and purposes for this lecture, Ur is the location where we have the account of one of what I would argue the first climate refugees. Ur is the location where a climate refugee that we know by as Abraham who I'm named after, probably had to leave as due to the inability, the scarcity of water, droughts. And if you notice, Ur back then was more or less seafront property. Abraham of Ur left. And just to see how water is so essential to that story, I used this painting in Spain of Abraham's first partner, Hajar, and their son Ismail, who were banished into the desert, to give you how important this kind of conflict over water was. The most seminal event in Hajar's expulsion was her desire to find water for Ismail, where in the desert she tried to collect water with the word Zem. And of course, giving Islam its most holiest site is connected to water. What is today, the pilgrimage in Mecca commemorates Hajar's upon being expelled by Abraham at the request of Sarah, who would later give birth to the progeny that would lead to the tribes of Israel. Hajar was expelled into the desert with Ismail, and it was Ismail, and then that desperate search for water. And here we have another kind of very important seminal event of ecological theology. Nevertheless, I'm trying to show how important contested water is. And not only this, but I want to give a shout out because I'm speaking to you not from San Diego, but from Barcelona. And just to show you how important this topic is for me, I'm presenting at 3 a.m. And I was visiting Barcelona, the American College of the Mediterranean. And I just wanted to show you one of the classes that they teach here, the Children of Abraham, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And I want to more or less, one of the factors that unites the Abrahamic faiths for all three faiths is the centrality of water. So whether it's Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, well, let's go over it. Okay. And I also just wanted to highlight an article that I was really interested in on the eve of October 7th, 2023. And this is the use of religion to foster, can Abraham bring peace, the relationship between acknowledging shared religious roots and intergroup conflict? Was, work that I was looking at before the events that would eventually, literally on the eve of, there were two research tracks I was looking at on the eve of October 7th. This is the first one, and then I'm going to talk today about the second research track that I was examining. But let's look at the following event being depicted here in a Muslim context, and this is the baptism of Jesus by his cousin John, otherwise known as John the Baptist. And I show this event just again to show you how important water is to all three faiths. Okay, because remember, for all intents and purposes, John the Baptist was a Jew baptizing a Jewish rabbi named Yeshua. And of course, that the fact that this event was seminal for Jews in that time, later, of course, for Christians. And then, of course, this is a Muslim depiction of the baptism of Jesus, okay, by John the Baptist, who is also, and both figures, don't forget, are prophets in the Islamic tradition. And sure enough, in what is today Iraq, there is a group of people who claim to be the descendants of the followers of John the Baptist. They're known as the Mandaeans. There's, a bit of debate about their origins. There are some claims that they're the descendants of the Samaritans and that they moved from the Jordan River to the Tigris and Euphrates basin. This is them conducting their baptismal rituals in the Tigris. Um, and of course, there is a large concentration of them in San Diego today because this is a community who has to live by flowing water to conduct their baptismal rites. And this is just a very good example of a community whose ability to access water is being affected by climate change. Okay, that's just kind of imagery of the Mandaeans. But let's go back to putting Gaza in its history. And if you look at All these references, I like this map because not only does it show the Greek legacy in the Middle East, but it takes away the borders, and you can see how the Tigris-Euphrates Basin, the Orontes, and the Jordan River are really what makes this area known as a fertile crescent. And you'll see even then, this is Greek became kind of a lingua franca of the region after Alexander the Great's conquest. And you'll see even then, of course, Gaza is there. Gaza was key for Alexander to conquer not only the Levant, the Eastern Mediterranean, but then make his way into Egypt and establishing the city of course, named after him, Alexandria. So again, if we look at then the Greek, the legacy of Alexander. Remember, in the lifetime of Jesus, okay, his life was written in Greek. But also, I would just want to show you another article around this time looking at climate droughts and wars and famines in Galilee as a background for understanding the historical Jesus. Again, you have references to this being a time of scarcity, that a lot of the miracles were to perform were because this was a time of scarcity. Okay. I go from the Old Testament, New Testament to now this book, a hydro-utopian science fiction novel written by Theodore Herzl. Altnoy Land was basically Theodore Herzl's vision for a future Jewish state, which we could also call a science fiction novel, where he describes a hydro-utopian state. But I would argue in that vision, what evolves is a hydro dystopia for another group of people. But before I describe the hydro dystopia emerged over time. If you look at this Time magazine cover, Yasser Arafat made his name as a result of leading a group known as Fatah, and Fatah backward is Halaka Tahrir Palestine, the movement for the liberation of Palestine that became one and the dominant faction of a coalition, an umbrella organization known as the PLO. Fatah rose to prominence in 1964. Its first more or less targeted campaign that brought it to the world's attention was targeting a water diversion facility operated by the Israeli Water Authority. Okay. And that just goes to show you how water became securitized, became an issue of basically a military issue. That's what we mean by the securitization of water. And I jump from there to the following. How did I get concerned about the situation of water? Was seeing what happened in Yemen after its aquifers were depleted. Now, in the Yemeni case, this was again the mismanagement of water. And the mismanagement of water kind of served as the background of three concurrent conflicts in the Middle East. In the case of Yemen, the aquifers were depleted due to the cultivation of a narcotic known as qat. Yemen is the birthplace of coffee, as we know it. Technically, it began in Ethiopia, but it grew in abundance in Yemen, so much so that the port in which coffee was shipped, the port of Macha, gives us the term mocha. When coffee was grown in the Dutch colony of Java, and in Brazil, the Yemenis couldn't keep up, so they switched to another crop known as khat, a narcotic that was very water intensive. And sure enough, the scarcity of water in Yemen was preceded again by another drought. This was in Syria in 2008, where its aquifers were depleted. And that was a prelude to having displaced farmers. And I want you to look at the role of displaced farmers, more or less going into places like Raqqa and giving ISIS a fertile ground of recruiting from those displaced farmers. That's Syria and its civil war in 2011. If you look at Yemen and its conflict and its civil war on the eve of 2011, this was the depletion of water. So my interest in depleted aquifers took me from Syria to Yemen, and then, of course, ultimately By 2019, I was looking at the situation of water in Gaza. Okay. And so I say basically what was a hydro utopia became a dystopian, what's often called an environmental Nakba, okay, for the Palestinian people, or what I call hydro-necropolitics. Now, what do I mean by necropolitics? Is a term developed by a Cameroonian scholar, Achille Memembe, who basically describes situations in which people experience a slow, inevitable death. A good way to explain slow death in kind of a local setting, let's go back to the land acknowledgement. When examples of slow death, even in our just before even the land acknowledgement, health disparities, the inability of people in certain, let's say, cities to get good, healthy food when they're bombarded with only junk food. That gives them a slow, inevitable death due to diabetes. You could say when Mexico was bombarded with American goods due to NAFTA with high sugar content, you condemned the people to a slow, inevitable death due to diabetes again. And when you again don't give access to, when clean water is not available to any population, whether we're talking about Flint, Michigan, the Tijuana River Basin, or again, the Gaza Strip. Okay, that is an example of not just necropolitics, but hydronecropolitics. It was this article that alarmed me to the situation of water in Gaza. Okay, and if we want to talk about the kind of the depleted aquifers, here they are. This is how they look on the map. Okay, so whether I'm talking about aquifers in Syria, Yemen, okay, or the contested aquifers here, now we're getting set up to the conflict. Okay. Now, what got me to raise the attention of how dire was the situation of water in Gaza was actually hydronecropolitics in Ukraine. You see, in the summer of 2023, Ukrainians, basically, I was looking at the case of what was deemed an ecocide. And in this case, the ecocide I was looking at was when Russia deliberately targeted a dam that more or less flooded downstream areas in Ukraine. Not only because what happened is when you deliberately flood these areas, not only was necropolitics affecting humans, animals in a zoo were deliberately drowned. But it's also the land is now forever destroyed because it's been inundated. So when I was writing about necropolitics in Ukraine, basically in June 2023, and here leads me to the prelude to October 2023, I raised the question whether it was weaponizing water in Ukraine. I asked myself, let's go back and look at the situation of water in Gaza. Okay, now this is again based on my research. And again, with the question, when a population is so thirsty, eventually, and so desperate for access to water, how long can they keep the situation before they use some kind of violence to make the world wake up to how dire their situation is? Okay. And of course, then we know now, tragically, the rest is history. So when I said the two research streams I was looking at on the eve of October 7th, 2023, one was the role of a shared Abrahamic legacy in looking at peace, but then also this other dire warning. With the water situation so dire in Gaza, I was wondering, would violence be inevitable, given the Syrian precedent, given the Yemen precedent? And that's where I will end. So thank you for bearing with me. And I asked the organizers if there are any questions now, if I could take them. And then if you would mind, I will sign off from Barcelona.
Okay, I can field some questions with the mic if anyone has a question for Dr. Marashi. Anyone have any questions? Or we can just let him go to sleep because
Thank you. That's very good.
I didn't realize that he was speaking from Barcelona. That's very generous of him to do that for us.
Very good.
All right.
All right, very good. Well, thank you for those of you who
Thank
attended this.
you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for doing this, Susie, and good luck, John.
Okay, so John.
Bye,
And
everyone.
bye. So you know how to take it over. Okay.
We'll find out. Well, Ibrahim signed off before I said thank you, but I really am grateful that he was willing to stay up till 3 a.m. in Barcelona to give this talk. So I'm very grateful for that. And I'm really grateful that you all are here. Can everybody hear me okay? Am I too loud? Cool. Thank you, Susie, for introducing this panel and for being here. I found out tonight there's a bunch of events on campus so that everybody that should be here is elsewhere, but we'll do a Trump. There are lots and lots and lots of people here, thousands and thousands. So I'm going to figure out how to share the screen before I say any more. Just give me 1 second, please. Let me actually first, yeah, there it is. Okay, now we need to figure out how to get rid of that side thing so that you can only see what I want you to see.
Slideshow.
Which slideshow? Because I'm not familiar with PowerPoint. I have a Mac thing.
See that little slideshow icon
Oh, down here?
right here. That's it. See if that'll do it.
It does, magic. Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Palestine and water in Palestine. And I'm not as smooth as Ibrahim, so I'm going to read my notes, or some of them, so I can stay on track. Otherwise, I'll ramble quite a bit. And let me say one more thing, and not my fault or nobody's fault. This projector is dying. So the images that you see are going to be tinted with this lime green. And 2 weeks ago, it wasn't anywhere near this bad, but tonight we have no way of fixing it. So my apologies for the really poor quality of this projector. So Palestine has an ancient and continuous history of agriculture that dates back 9,000 years. Scholars believe that the earliest human communities that transitioned from nomadic to settled existence and began to plant and rotate crops and domesticated animals occurred in the Jordan River Valley around a city that became known as Jericho. Still thriving ancient city that is part of the historical land of Palestine. And if you're ever, oops, sorry, hold on. If you're ever in Palestine, I would strongly recommend that you go to Jericho. As with all traditional agricultural communities, agricultural knowledge has evolved and has been passed down through countless generations of farmers over thousands of years. In Arabic, farmers are called fallahin, or tillers of the land. And I really like that idea of their relationship to the land. Palestine's agricultural traditions have survived natural as well as human-made catastrophes and have persisted through repeated cycles of invasions, occupations, and displacement. But the ancient history of indigenous Palestinian agriculture has been experiencing a series of severe existential threats that may now be driving Palestinian agriculture to its demise. Palestinian farmers and shepherds in the West Bank are currently facing a perfect storm of political, economic, and environmental conditions that have all been greatly exacerbated by Israel's ever-expanding settler colonial occupation of Palestinian lands. That's supposed to be a black coat. Limited access to water is a critical and central problem for Palestinian farmers, as well as for all Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza. Palestinians that live in Israel, and there's about 1 million of them, do not face the same problem of water shortages because they live in Israel and Israelis get abundant amounts of waters. Israel diverts massive amounts of water from natural aquifers to supply Israeli settlements, farms, and factories in the West Bank. This has greatly reduced the amount of water available for Palestinians. The process of diverting water, combined with Israel's near total control of water sources and severe restrictions of distribution of water to Palestinian cities, towns, farmlands, and orchards, is a central part of a multi-pronged and carefully calibrated strategy that is designed to undermine the ability of Palestinians to feed their families, maintain their communities, and to experience a dignified and sustainable existence on their own land. Without access to water, life is unsustainable. Control and access to water, as well as sources of water, gives Israel tremendous power that enables it to control the life of every Palestinian in the West Bank. Israel's strategy is designed to make life for Palestinians as difficult, intolerable, and unsustainable as possible, so that Palestinians with any means will self-selectively abandon their homeland, and those who remain will experience profound levels of suffering and misery that it will make it easier to drive them out of their homeland. The United States used a comparable strategy while ethnically cleansing and erasing the cultures and history of the indigenous populations of this country, of this continent, from their native lands. The difference is that Israel is implementing that strategy over a much shorter period of time. Water is one of the critical elements that Israel uses to undermine Palestinian food sovereignty and sustainable agriculture, with the goal of further driving Palestinians off the land. Denial of access to water, combined with the expropriation of massive tracts of native lands, are two very important parts of the culture of dominance that undermines the Palestinians' effort to remain on their native land. Water is not talked about very often because the level of punitive control and collective punishment is mostly invisible to the outside world. Water, land, land theft, denial of access to water, persistent displacement of civilian populations, and a comprehensive system of military laws that governs every aspect of Palestinian life under occupation comprises Israel's iron fist of settler colonial dominance and supremacist repression. Israel's occupation of the West Bank is a clear demonstration of Achille Mbembe's theory, which identifies necropolitics as the implementation of orchestrated political power designed to set up conditions that define how people that are subjected to that power may live and how they may die. Since 1967, the enormous confiscation of land throughout the West Bank by Israel's occupying forces has been used for the following: the building of military bases, and there's a whole bunch of them, developing restricted areas that are used as firing ranges for the military, developing a massive network of Israeli settlements that now houses over 600,000 settlers when you include East Jerusalem settlements, defining immense buffer zones that surround each of the settlements, building large-scale agricultural and industrial enterprises that have been established throughout the West Bank. These are Israeli-only complexes. Constructing a network of roads and overpasses that dissect the West Bank, and when the roads are closed, which they often get closed by military checkpoints, those roads restrict the ability of Palestinians to travel between cities, between towns, and between villages. Even neighboring villages have to walk over hills to access each other. And sometimes those hills are not accessible because settlements are at the top of those hills. The state-supported multifaceted enterprise of settlements, military bases, industrial scale farms and factories, wildlife preserves, combined with hundreds of permanent and rolling checkpoints, and the pernicious apartheid wall, which you've seen a very small part of it, 430 miles long, are all built on stolen Palestinian land. So this little segment of the wall, I took this picture, I want to say in 2007, and the wall was still being constructed. And often we see walls in Kalendia checkpoint with lots of graffiti, but mostly it's just this really banal gray monstrosity that's 27 feet tall. And you see that little figure, that woman walking there with stuff on her head. She probably had to walk maybe a mile and a half to a gate that's controlled by soldiers so that she can exit her village to go to the next village. So it's a really restrictive system of boundaries, of confining concrete barriers. Collectively, Israel's settler colonial enterprise in the West Bank is buttressed by Israel's powerful military and heavily militarized communities of settlers. That whole enterprise is enforced by a system of draconian military laws that govern the Palestinians living under Israeli occupation. The primary objective of settler colonial enterprise is to separate Palestinian villages and towns from each other, and to separate farmers from their farmlands, from their orchards, as well as from the markets that they need to reach in order to sell their agricultural products. The ultimate and now seemingly approaching goal of this strategy is to displace the native Palestinians from their land and to fully possess and to dominate all of Palestine. Permit me to share with you a couple of the many stories that I've listened to and have collected related to water and agriculture in Palestine. Anyone who studies the occupation of Palestine will read about water as a powerful tool of controlling the occupied population. And I had read about it a lot, but I had never really experienced it firsthand until I was in Gaza in 2005. The photo on the screen was not shot last week, because we've seen a lot of images of destruction. It was not shot last month or even last year. It was shot in 2005 when I was in Gaza. The destruction behind the boys, which was spread out throughout Gaza, is but a sliver of the massive genocidal destruction that continues to be inflicted on the Palestinian population of Gaza. I was staying in the town of Rafah, in the very southern end of Gaza. And in 2005, Rafah had a population of 162,000 people. It had started out at a refugee camp in 1948 that just grew out to be a massive city. And the population before the 2023 war was around 250,000 in Rafah alone. The population of all of Gaza in 2005, when I was there, was 1.3 million people, and that's 1 million less than the 2.3 million inhabitants of Gaza that have been experiencing the genocidal destruction of their society and their land over the last 16 months. I was in Rafah to work on a project, a mural project in a community health care center. It was August. It was very, very hot and very, very humid. 3 days after arriving, just as we were getting started on working on this project, the water in the whole city of Rafah was shut off by the Israeli occupation forces. All of the pipes bringing water into the city went dry. This was something somewhat manageable for a couple of days, because every building has these water tanks on the roof that collect water and then through gravity release it when it's needed. But even with the rationing of water, and everybody was really good about rationing and controlling, the tanks ran dry pretty quickly, and the quality of life in the city changed dramatically as soon as the water ran out. People who were already miserable, impoverished, brutalized by the occupation could not bathe, could not wash, could not use water to cook, and most noticeably, could not flush their toilets. You think of 162,000 people who can't flush their toilets for days at a time. The only water available to drink was water that was bottled in Israel and sold to the Palestinians. That water had been diverted from the aquifer under Gaza and sent to Israel through a network of pipes. First, it was sold to the settlement, which had luxurious green lawns, and then it was shipped out or piped out to be bottled and sold back to the Palestinians. In Gaza, now, 95% of the natural water supply is contaminated. The coastal aquifer that provides the largest water or natural water source for Gaza has been depleted and contaminated with seawater and sewage. The water wells and natural springs that the Palestinians could access have run so low, so dry, that the water has become unfit for human consumption and even for the irrigation of agriculture of plants, due to the heavy amount of salt and minerals that has leached in from the sea and minerals from the soil. And one of the things I noticed when I was in Gaza, and it didn't occur to me at first, is how ruined people's teeth were, men and women, not just out of smoking, but out of this heavy salinated water that they had to drink because they often didn't have any option. Their teeth, across the board, people in their 30s, 40s, 50s had developed these very dark teeth, and they were kind of just almost like thin. They were falling or being kind of worn out in their mouth. But the most directly uncomfortable thing, besides being thirsty when I was in Gaza and the water was shut off, and not being able to wash on very hot, humid weather, was the smell of unflushed toilet. That smell permeated every room in every building. The whole city smelled like shit. And there was nothing that people could do about it. It greatly raised the level of frustration, of tension, of agitation between the people. And that was part of the strategy, get people to be so upset that they take it out on each other. It was not only terribly uncomfortable, but deeply degrading. This is especially true for a population that greatly values cleanliness in their homes. No one that I knew why the water had been turned off, but this was far from the first time that the water had been turned off. After several days, a trickle of water was turned back on, just enough to tease the population and to further enforce the reality that they were under the full control of the occupiers. When the genocidal bombardment of Gaza began in October 2023, the water distribution as well as the treatment plants were very quickly bombed and destroyed, leaving 2.3 million people desperate for water, and they still are in Gaza. Permit me to transfer you from Gaza to a village called Deir Balut, located in the western sector of the central West Bank. Can you see my pointer? Yeah, you can. Deir Balut, this is the West Bank. Deir Balut is around here. Ramallah is there. Jerusalem is there. Nablus is there. Jenin is there. Hebron is down in here. And Bethlehem is right there. And this is the boundaries of the whole West Bank, what they call the Green Line that was part of the armistice of 1948 that separated Israel from the West Bank, which was controlled by Jordan. Deir Balut, as I mentioned, is right there. It's very close to the armistice line. It's referred to as the Green Line. And in case you don't know it, Israel has never agreed to define its borders, as it plans to continue to expand its territory to include the West Bank and Gaza, as well as Jordan, Lebanon, most of Syria, part of Egypt, and part of Iraq. And I'm not making this up. This is part of the historical maps in early Zionism of having this entire land. And it's still used, and in the war, in the horrific atrocities, some of the soldiers have a map of Greater Israel badges on their sleeves. From the river to the sea for Israel means from the Nile River to the Euphrates River and to the Mediterranean Sea. So here's a close-up map focusing on Deir Balut, which is, where's my little mouse? There it is. It's this little village. And what you see, all these blue things are the settlements around it. They're all high up in the hill. There are other large villages. This was all right here, Deir Balut's agricultural land. These are boundaries of the buffer zones. This is the wall, the apartheid wall. And then frankly, I'm not sure what this orange is on the map. There was not a guide. And this is just a little spot. So Deir Balut is a farming village of less than 4,000 inhabitants. In addition to being blocked in by the Green Line, it's also surrounded by a series of large settlements. It's really kind of this chain of settlements. Buffer zones around the settlements, they're designed to separate the settlements from the village, and a bunch of Israeli-only access roads that take you to the settlements, and as well as a number of rolling checkpoints that can quickly seal the village and prohibit entrance and exit. So as you can see, you got to enter one way or the other, and access to the village can often be pretty difficult, in or out. There's also the wall, the apartheid wall. But this little red, these two little red arrows, if I remember correctly, right there, they're access that workers can use to enter Israel, and Israeli settlers can use to enter Israel and drive through. Let me just say one more thing about, I don't know where it happened. I guess I can't go back. But this is the district. It's that central district called Salfit in the central, just north central West Bank, and it's on the western edge of that district. The village is ancient and has gained some notoriety in recent decades because it's only one of two villages in the West Bank where most of the farming is done by women. The reason for that is the majority of the men, at least those who can obtain permits, work as construction workers inside Israel, or they work as construction workers or gardeners inside the nearby Israeli settlements. The reason the men no longer work the land is because a very large share of their agricultural lands and orchards were expropriated by the settlements and the buffer zones that surround the settlements and the apartheid wall that blocks access to the village. So their land, which was quite sizable, shrunk to this very, very small area. Not even a year, less than a year after I left, I was there in 2019, recording oral history with the farmers. The military designated an additional 4,000 dunams. A dunam is a quarter of an acre, so 1,000 acres of the village's land to be taken to expand one of the settlements. And since then, more land has been taken from Deir Balut since 2019. After large portions of the village's agricultural land were expropriated in the late 70s and early 80s, that's when they started building the settlements in that area. 83, I think, is when they built the settlement that's closest to Deir Balut. The villagers could not produce enough food to support themselves and to sell to market. So consequently, the men had to go to work as day laborers, and the women now farmed the remaining land. And they're really the most amazing people I had met. They're powerful, thoughtful, clear-minded, very committed to maintaining their communities and maintaining their right to their land. I lost my place. So the men work as day laborers, construction workers, or gardeners. But when the checkpoints are closed and the work permits are rescinded, which they can be literally just at a snap of a finger, the men sit idle and are not able to contribute any income to their families, leaving the women as the sole earners. Work in construction in Israel or in the settlements can feel somewhat lucrative for poor Palestinian farmer, but it creates a culture of dependence that is very precarious. A farmer named Abu Ibrahim, an elderly farmer from the village of Ain Kinya, who I also interviewed a number of times, told me during a conversation about his land. He said, and I'm going to quote, "I could feed my family for the whole year with the food I grew, but we rarely had any money. My sons earn money as laborers and can feed their families for a few days with the wages they earn. But if their work stops or the roads are closed by the checkpoints, which they often are, they all go hungry." And that's the dilemma. There's no land to farm, and they become totally reliant on construction work, and the work stops and people go hungry. There's a bunch of other things maybe I'll say during Q&A, but let me keep rolling here. Because Deir Balut's agricultural lands are all in Area C, which is controlled entirely by Israel, it is part of the West Bank. It was supposed to be turned over in the 1994 Oslo Accord. It was supposed to be turned over to the Palestinians in 5 years. It's been a bit over 5 years. They face tremendous restrictions because the Israeli military has total control. Israel has dug deep wells in their land and has diverted the water and pumps it up to the Israeli settlements. The residents of the settlements enjoy the luxury of communal swimming pools, of green lawns, of wash cars, of long showers, just like we do, while the villagers barely have enough to drink and wash, and certainly not enough to irrigate their crops. The villagers cannot obtain permits to dig deeper wells. They have older wells that have run dry. They need a permit for everything. Or to get permits to build cisterns, to collect rainwater, or permits to build structures, to process, to dry, to pack, and to store their crops. They also receive constant harassment when transporting their crops to market in other villages. They somehow, it seems to get timed. When a truck of tomatoes is going from the field to market in another village, the checkpoints will appear and that truck will sit in the hot sun for 9-10 hours, and the quality of the tomatoes will not be as good. So think about this. Israel even controls the rain. Rainwater harvesting systems, which have been set up numerous times by Palestinians, are regularly demolished by the Israeli military. So you set up a rain harvesting system next to your house, they come and bulldoze it. Military Order 158, which was issued in 1967 when Israel first occupied the West Bank and is still enforced to this day, states that Palestinians cannot control any water installations, dig new wells, or deepen existing wells without a permit from the Israeli military authority. When water becomes unavailable, which it often does, low-income Palestinians have to spend as much as half their monthly salary to purchase water that is trucked in with these water tanks. A study in 2024 by the Israeli monitoring organization Beit Salem showed that Israeli settlements in the West Bank used an average of 65 gallons of water per day per person, while Palestinians in the West Bank used an average of 22 gallons per day per person. Now, this average includes Palestinians in the city, which have a lot better water conditions because the PA buys water and distributes it to the city. So 22 gallons a day, think of that as for the cities, and the farmers get a whole lot less. Additionally, the study showed that Israelis living in settlements get water every day of the week, while only 1/3 of the Palestinians in the West Bank have access to water every day of the week. Some only have running water once per month. To put the 22 gallon per day average in perspective, the average San Diegan consumes 88 gallons per water per day. 80% of the water that's used in the West Bank is controlled and conveyed by Israel, by Israeli national water company Mekorot. To provide for its people, the Palestinian Authority has to purchase water from Mekorot. The water they purchased was originally sourced from Palestinian aquifer. It's this weird cycle. Mekorot can shut off the flow of water to any village, any town, any city at will, and they do. Studies by hydrologists working for the Palestinian Authority estimate that access to water has been reduced by 35% since October 7, 2023. The district of Hebron, which is in the southern West Bank, has been receiving approximately 1/3 of the amount of water that it normally receives, leaving the population to rely on paying for water delivered by tankers in order to fill their cisterns. Also, armed Israeli settlers backed by the military are denying Palestinian farmers access to the natural springs that they have traditionally relied on to water their orchards and their fields and to bring water to their homes. This form of collective punishment is nothing less than hydrological apartheid, imposed by the military occupation on the occupied civilian population. As the occupying power in the West Bank, Israel has clearly defined responsibilities under international law to protect the rights of the occupied Palestinian population. This includes the fundamental human right to water. In addition to the water restrictions, the villages in Deir Balut face constant harassment from the settlers who live in the surrounding settlements, and most settlements are up in the hillside, so they have visual control, they have control access to the land. For example, sewage runoff from the settlement is often directed to the fields, creating an environmental hazard for the farm workers in addition to ruining the crops and undermining the fertility of the land. Additionally, the farmers, and I heard this from many farmers, complain of wild pigs being released from the settlements to destroy the crops and foul the area, making the remaining crops impure for the Muslim villages. An example of the violent harassment for the villages occurred on December 6, 2020. when Israeli bulldozers destroyed in just one day 3,400 olive trees, in addition to fig and almond trees that belonged to the village. And this is one village, one little village. So think about the big picture here. A few weeks earlier, they had bulldozed hundreds of acres of farmland. In April 2024, almost a year ago, Israeli settlers descended on the village, burning cars and vandalizing homes and threatening people. On January 29th of this year, just barely less than a month ago, the Israeli military demolished a home in Deir Balut, displacing a large Palestinian family. Those are only a few of the incidents that I could read about in relationship to Deir Balut. And that short list does not include the hundreds of everyday harassments and humiliations inflicted on the women, on the men, and on the children of the village. To counteract the lack of water, some Palestinian farmers have reverted to traditional methods of agriculture that require very little water. One of the methods is referred to as ba'al in Arabic. It's a labor-intensive process. That requires repeated tilling of the soil until it has a very, very fine and porous texture. The seedlings are then planted and watered by hand for the first week or two until they begin to establish just broad enough roots. And then the plants rely on moisture gathered from the dew. But it also requires a ton of work because the farmer has to constantly weed around the plants to minimize competition for that limited amount of water. So it's a very labor-intensive process, but it's a traditional process. But with climate change and the increase in rise in temperature, ba'al farming is becoming even less viable. The problem with traditional ba'al agriculture is that it's low yield. These are very tender plants. They don't grow bushy because they don't use fertilizers and chemicals. It's low yield planting, it's very labor intensive, and many of the traditional crops that have over the centuries adapted to the native soil and to planting methods are no longer available, as the seeds have become extinct or nearly extinct over the course of 6 decades of using modern, modified non-native crops that provide higher yields but require regular constant irrigation, as well as large amounts of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. The use of non-native modified seed was once beneficial to farmers as it provided higher crop yields, but the reliance on constant irrigation from water sources that have become scarce, as well as the purchase of seeds, fertilizers, and pesticides from Israeli conveyors is very costly and has become unsustainable for small-scale farmers. An additional devastating problem that has resulted from chemical-based agriculture is the large increase in cases of cancer and leukemia in Palestinian villages. I read an article in 2018 when I was preparing to go do oral history work that observed that children in farming communities in Gaza and in the West Bank were displaying increased rates of cancer in Palestine. And when I was in the villages, I would ask specifically about that. And the folks, especially in the villages that still had chemical agriculture going on, they were really reluctant to answer that. They said, yes, but what can we do? Yes, but what can we do? And it was a heartbreaking thing to think about. And there are many, many more stories about the demise of agriculture and the resilience of Palestinian farmers, because it's not just all downhill. There's a lot of fighting going on. Farmers to share with you, but not enough time to share them during this brief presentation. I'll end with a very short reflection on the fate of Palestinian shepherds by sharing part of the experience of a family of semi-nomadic sheep herders who grazed their flocks in the northeastern West Bank. As semi-nomadic shepherds, they used to pack up and relocate their camp a couple of times a year to more effectively graze and water their herds. Their existence is fairly rudimentary, with no electricity or running water, just a few tents, a corrugated metal structure, as you see behind, to protect their flocks from the scorching sun, and a few tanks of water that are filled by water tanker trucks that are called in when needed. The shepherds no longer pitched their camp near natural springs, which was the traditional habit as their elders and ancestors had done, because the settlers and the military chased them off with violent harassment and deadly threats. The family of Hussein Ashraf Bisharat, the gentleman in the middle there, consists of the elderly couple, his two sons that have remained, others have moved to cities, remain with him on the land, their spouses, and a growing number of grandchildren. They come from a lineage of shepherds that herded their flocks across the hills of the eastern West Bank for countless generations. But their livelihood appears to be coming to an end, as a growing number of settlements and military outposts in the areas have made it very difficult to graze and water their flocks. They face constant harassment and increasing threats from the settlers and the military. When I visited them, they had recently rebuilt the metal structure that you saw right behind them that shelters their flock. It had been bulldozed by the military along with their tents, their water tanks, and the whole encampment. And the reason that was given is that they did not have a permit to build on their land, on the land. This was not the first time that their encampment had been destroyed or their safety threatened. They are repeatedly told by the military that they must sell their flock and move to a town. So I ask, what can an aging shepherd do when he can no longer walk the valleys and roam the open hills that sustained generations of his ancestors and nurtured him since his childhood? What can a displaced shepherd do in a town except wait to die or to wait to be displaced again and again by supremacist settler colonial culture that demands total control of the land and its water, all of its natural resources, and control all of its native people? The facts on the ground clearly demonstrate that Israel's strategy is to steadily decrease access to the land and to reduce access to water, so that the Palestinians will only have the option of leaving the land or watching their children die of thirst or hunger. We are witnesses to a genocide. So Ibrahim is gone, and I'm happy to take any questions. And Susie, come up, you can take questions with me. This gentleman back there.
So in 2005, that was a pretty pivotal year, right? Because that was when the Zionist colony, the settlers left Gaza.
Yep.
So were you there after the blockade started, after the siege
I
started?
had to leave Gaza right before they started removing the settlers. So they started removing the settlers at the very end of August 2005. So when I was there, they had not started to remove them yet.
And
So,
then what's the viability of water desalination?
the Palestinians can't afford it. Israel has desalination plants that in northern Israel, but the Palestinians have no way to access. I think it's a very expensive and very energy demanding process. So it could provide wonderful resources, but it also needs tremendous resources to build it and to run it.
Isn't there more like a rudimentary way to do it, of like just digging and letting water, like digging near the beach and letting water just kind of seep up, and then the salt water or the salty parts just kind of go down to the bottom, and then the fresh water goes up?
I don't know. I really don't know about that method. I mean, there probably are simple ways where you can collect small amounts of water.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Right. But I don't know enough about them. And I think people that have lived in dry conditions have probably experimented with that.
Yeah.
But I would guess that if it was a viable method, it would have been used. We would have heard about it a lot more. So I don't know. Thank you for those questions. Are there any other questions or comments? Please feel free to ask. All right.
Thank you for those powerful stories, John. It's always hard to hear what people have been going through, so appreciate it.
Thank you guys for listening. And I do mean that we are witnesses here. And I think my purpose in collecting the stories is for me to be a witness, but also to bring those stories back so our communities become witnesses to a genocide that goes on. And it's been a slow genocide, slow kind of moving genocide, a cultural genocide at first, and now it's become a physical genocide. And we have to, I don't know what we have to do, but we have to acknowledge the fact that it exists, because now Trump is creating videos about the future of Gaza, and it doesn't even in any way mention the atrocities that have taken place and the horrendous conditions that people are living under. So thank you guys for being here and for listening and for being interested and for learning. And if there's one thing I can say is make sure that you talk about this with others so they're engaged, because everything that our government is doing is about silencing and erasing and sweeping under the rug. So we have to keep that experience on the forefront of people's consciousness. And there was a point last year with the protests that we thought the tides were turning, but now they're turning back the other way, with a lot of repression across campuses, with a lot of repression across the government, across the country, where the government is threatening federal funding to people that even speak about Palestine. So are we going to be silenced, or we will continue to speak? And we need to do it in a smart way. So my rationale is that we continue to speak and we continue to educate, but mostly we continue to learn. So thank you all for your attention. Any other questions? I'm happy to address them, or comments. You're welcome to say. Please, got one more.
Any comments on the fact that Israel doesn't acknowledge its own borders and wants to take over like Litani and the Golan Heights, which it's cementing even further now? Where does it end is my question. And then also, how many people in their population do they need to actually take over these lands? And considering the fact that now immigration to the settler colony has started to slow down big time, and immigration out of it has started to expand. What's their logic? I mean, do they actually think that they can hold on to Palestine indefinitely? I mean, nobody in the region can tolerate to live with genocidal maniacs like this.
I agree with you, but at the same time, a lot of Arab countries have remained quiet and have
Oh, the leaderships are all
Yeah.
traitors.
Yeah.
But as far as the
And-
regular
and-
population is concerned,
And the people, if the people rise, they will be massacred by the leadership. So Arab countries have been mild in their response. I was going to say cowardly, but mild in their response. But I think there's a imperialist mindset of expanding, of gaining land, of gaining the resources of those lands, of having power, right? It's not so much about numbers. The British were not a very populous country, but they ruled massive empires and they lorded over people. And I think that imperial mindset drives it. It starts out as sort of colonial, and then it expands into empire. And this expansion is taking place. Southern Lebanon, they're not moving out. Syria, they want to expand and create big buffer zones. The West Bank is pretty much done. Gaza, well, Trump is going to make it the Gaza Strip, as in this big
Las Vegas.
chain of strip joints across the Mediterranean. So I'm not in any way optimistic these days. I think we're going through really dark times that are going to become very, very bloody and darker. So I don't put any faith in the Palestinian so-called Arab brothers. They've proven themselves to be self-serving and unreliable, let's just say. Yeah. Please, there's a question over there from that gentleman. And we're using the microphone because we're recording this and this will be on our YouTube channel when it gets edited in a week or two, so others, the thousands and thousands and thousands that are here can watch it again.
Thank you so much for speaking today.
Thank you.
I think throughout my time in like learning about these topics and researching them, I always look for the comparisons and the similarities in other movements and how they all have these similar struggles, and how you mentioned the difference between the United States and the Israeli ethnical cleansing is that it's happening on a much faster scale and a much shorter time frame. How have you been able to convey the synergies between the levels of oppression in Palestine and other movements in terms of like creating more of a collective um, combatant to the oppression that we have in terms of silencing, folks in our country? I always see like similar to like the reselling of the water is similar. So when you have the LA Eaton fires, right, and folks are having to now commodify a resource that is a birthright, how do you help like convey that in a way that's digestible for folks in the States to somewhat feel connected more to such a distant issue?
Yeah, I think it's been a challenge, but I think we do it one bit at a time. We do it in things like this, these little educational events. I mean, these are university events where people that are eager to learn are already here, but we do it by presenting things publicly. We do it through cultural events. I'm a visual artist. I make drawings, I make paintings, and they're seen by people in the drawings and paintings about displacement. So occasionally people are informed by those images. They're not just they're not decorative paintings, let's just say. But we do it by learning and then teaching. And I think identifying the realities that all people who are not economically privileged are in many ways oppressed. And identifying those histories of oppression and the methods of oppression that happen here, that happen in LA, that happen across the country. Start with local, clarify the picture of suffering within the local communities and then connect those across. But one of the strategies that has been used by settler colonial powers and empires is to separate people, to isolate them, to make their lives so miserable that they have no ability to look beyond that hole that they have been thrown into. And that's a problem. But I think we have abilities to communicate. We have media to communicate with, and we have the ability to reach. So Gaza, for example, this last 16 months could have happened without us knowing hardly anything about it. But it took a bunch of remarkable folks with their phones, and when they had internet connection, could send pictures. That got us to be informed, and it got thousands of people across this country to be enraged and to demonstrate. And these gestures of solidarity with communities of colors, with indigenous communities, began to solidify. They were there. These movements were there, but only on a very sort of advanced level. Then they became much more, much broader. I'm not sure if I'm making sense with that, but so even when I was in college, there were people identifying American Indian movement and saying, oh, that movement is not just, that experience is not just unique to the indigenous population, but let's look at the folks in Africa, let's look at the folks in Latin America. Back in the 60s and 70s, very few people talked about Palestine, but now they're talking about Palestine as part of that equation of suffering. But how do you think? What do you think? How do we do it?
I mean, I think I see it in like creating a cross collaboration, but through like inorganic means. So like whether that's like through the exchange of other cultural methods, like if it's food or music and just different forms of that culture, letting that be the bridging point, and then from there having deeper conversations about their histories, whether that be oral or like digitally archived, in which they're able to kind of start seeing those similarities where it's not sort of like forced upon them. Because I feel like people nowadays, their idea of like being exceptional means they're unfazed and that they come out of this unscathed within our own cultures and our own sub communities of marginalization. And so when they're able to start like having, joyous forms of expression that are bringing them together and then getting into the weeds of why they're all under the same struggles, it tends to be more receptive. But I'm still figuring out that as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think also making the effort to visit other cultures, whether they're sort of in cities that we don't go to or parts of cities, or even just going to places like Palestine or going to places in Latin America or Africa that, and it's not an easy trip. This is not like comfortable travel. But for example, one of the things that I've been consistently impressed with when in Palestine working with the farmers is that there were internationals visiting and helping. So every year in the fall, when it's olive harvest time, October, November, there's sizable groups of internationals that come and spend 3-4 weeks helping farmers in different areas collect or harvest their olives. And they especially focus on farmers that have been harassed by settlers or had their, like B'deir Balut, where they had 3,400 olive trees bulldozed. You know, they go to those areas because the settlers are a bit more reluctant to attack Palestinians when there are Americans and Europeans and people from Latin America there up in the trees with them picking olives. So those gestures of solidarity are not simply kind of academic solidarity or verbal solidarity. It's on the ground work where you share bread with these people, where you sweat with them, where you face the threats with them. And when I was in Gaza in 2005, I was hosted by a family whose house had been demolished several times, and one of the times was when an American volunteer named Rachel Corey tried to protect the house and was run over by a bulldozer. Right, this amazing young woman stood in front of this massive tank-sized bulldozer to stop it. Maybe it was a naive gesture. It was clearly a nonviolent gesture of resistance. But we don't need to go stand in front of bulldozers, but I think making those trips on the grounds. And there are organizations that facilitate those trips. International organization, Via Campesino, sets up yearly volunteer travels to Palestine, where you go and work with the Palestinians on harvesting their crops. There are other organizations that send internationals to live in Palestinian villages that are being harassed by the military and settlers. And I wish I could remember the names, but there are multiple organizations. International Solidarity Movement is one of them, but there's a European organization that is really effective, and they send people, usually a group of 3 internationals that will live in the village, and they become frontline witnesses and documenting what goes on. So that sort of active solidarity is really important. Being a witness is really important. Thank you for those questions. Thank you all for being here.